Thunder crackled across the darkened sky as sheets of rain battered the suburban streets of Maple Grove. The usually peaceful neighborhood had transformed into a haunting tableau of shadow and storm, with only the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the rows of identical houses that lined Cedar Street. In the midst of this tempest, a single figure stood resolute. Mick, a large German shepherd with intelligent eyes and rain-soaked fur, maintained an unwavering vigil beside an abandoned silver sedan. The car had appeared shortly before sunset, its presence unremarkable until Mick's peculiar behavior drew the attention of the residents. The dog, known throughout the neighborhood for his gentle demeanor, now stood with hackles raised and muscles taut, his protective stance a stark contrast to his usual friendly disposition. Each time lightning split the sky, his silhouette cast long shadows across the flooded pavement, creating an almost mythical image of guardianship. Sarah Martinez, watching from her living room window, was the first to notice something amiss. She had lived in the neighborhood long enough to recognize most vehicles, and this particular sedan seemed out of place. But it was Mick's behavior that truly caught her attention. The dog, who typically greeted passers-by with an enthusiastic wag of his tail, now growled low in his throat at anyone who dared approach the vehicle. "There's something not right about this," Sarah muttered to herself, reaching for her phone to call her neighbor, Mrs. Martyr, who had always shown a particular understanding of the neighborhood's four-legged residents. As word spread through the community's group chat, more faces appeared in windows, and a few brave souls ventured onto their porches, huddled under umbrellas as they watched the unfolding scene. The rain, showing no signs of relenting, created a constant drumbeat against rooftops and pavement, punctuated by the occasional rumble of thunder. Jacob Reynolds, a former Marine who lived 3 houses down, was the first to step beyond his porch. His military training had taught him to trust his instincts, and something about this situation set off warning bells in his mind. The lean, wiry man moved with practiced caution, his bare feet silent against the wet concrete despite his purposeful stride. "Easy there, boy," Jacob called out, his voice barely audible above the storm. He had seen Mick nearly every day for the past 2 years, often sharing moments of quiet companionship during his morning runs. But tonight something was different. The dog's usual warm brown eyes held an intensity that Jacob had never witnessed before. As Jacob approached, Mick's posture shifted subtly. While maintaining his protective stance, the shepherd's eyes seemed to plead with Jacob, as if trying to communicate something of vital importance. The former Marine stopped several feet away, studying both the dog and the sedan with growing concern. The crowd of onlookers had grown, despite the worsening weather. Lightning illuminated worried faces as neighbors debated whether to call animal control or the police. Some argued that Mick might have rabies, while others insisted something more sinister was at play. The tension in the air was palpable, mixing with the electric charge of the storm. "Has anyone tried reaching Linda?" someone called out, referring to Mick's owner. The question was met with head shakes and murmured negatives. Linda Moreno hadn't been seen in the neighborhood for several days, which wasn't entirely unusual given her work schedule, but now that absence felt somehow significant. It was Mrs. Martyr's arrival that changed the atmosphere. The elderly woman had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone else and had an almost supernatural ability to understand animals. Despite the rain, she made her way down the street with deliberate steps, her gray hair plastered to her face, but her eyes sharp and focused. "He's protecting something," she announced with quiet certainty, her voice carrying despite its softness. "Look at how he positions himself. This isn't aggression, it's guardianship." The crowd fell silent, save for the continuous patter of rain and distant thunder. Mrs. Martyr's words seemed to shift the entire mood of the gathering. What had initially felt like a potential threat now took on a different character entirely. The neighbors exchanged glances, their fear giving way to curiosity and concern. As if in response to Mrs. Martyr's understanding, Mick's posture relaxed slightly, though he maintained his position beside the car. His eyes, intelligent and determined, moved between the gathered neighbors and the vehicle he guarded with such dedication. The rain continued to soak his fur, but he showed no signs of discomfort or fatigue. The storm intensified, driving most of the onlookers back to their porches, But a core group remained: Jacob, Mrs. Martyr, and Sarah Martinez, who had finally ventured outside. They stood in silent vigil, watching as Mick continued his steadfast guardianship of whatever secret the sedan held. Lightning flashed again, closer this time, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder that made several people jump. In that brilliant moment of illumination, Jacob caught a glimpse of something through the sedan's rain-streaked windows, a shadow or movement that made his heart skip a beat. His military instincts kicked into high gear, and he knew it was time to call for professional help. Sarah was already dialing her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she punched in the numbers. "We need Officer Harris," she said decisively. "He'll know what to do." Clark Harris had been the neighborhood's go-to police officer for years, known for his level head and compassionate approach to community issues. As they waited for Officer Harris to arrive, the storm seemed to gather strength, as if nature itself was participating in the drama unfolding on Cedar Street. The wind picked up, sending leaves and small branches skittering across the flooded pavement. Through it all, Mick remained unmoved, his dedication unwavering in the face of the elements. Mrs. Martyr moved closer to the dog, speaking to him in soft, soothing tones that barely carried above the storm. "You're a good boy, Mick," she murmured. "You're doing exactly what you need to do." The shepherd's ears twitched at her words, but his eyes never left the sedan. The gathered neighbors huddled closer together, sharing umbrellas and concerned whispers as they waited. The storm's fury seemed to mirror their growing anxiety, each flash of lightning revealing new details about the scene. The way Mick first stood on end, the mysterious shadows within the car, the increasing urgency in the dog's protective stance. In the distance, the faint wail of a siren could be heard approaching, its sound distorted by the wind and rain. Help was coming, but as the neighbors watched Mick maintain his vigilant guard, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to uncover something that would change their quiet community forever. The sound of the siren grew louder, cutting through the storm's chaos like a blade. Mick's ears perked forward, but his position remained unchanged. Whatever secret he was protecting, whatever duty he had been charged with, he would not abandon it. Not even as the first flash of police lights began to paint the rain-soaked street in alternating patterns of red and blue. The police lights transformed the rainy night into a surreal display of color, reflecting off every wet surface and creating ghostly patterns across the faces of the gathered neighbors. Officer Clark Harris's cruiser rolled to a stop several yards from the sedan, its headlights cutting through the downpour to illuminate Mick's steadfast form. The German shepherd's fur glistened with each sweep of red and blue, but his determined stance never wavered. Clark emerged from his vehicle, with the practiced caution of a veteran officer, his movements deliberate despite the urgency of the situation. He'd known these streets for 15 years, had watched children grow up here, had shared countless cups of coffee on front porches with the residents who now stood huddled in the rain. But something about tonight felt different. There was an electricity in the air that had nothing to do with the storm. "Evening, folks," he called out, his deep voice carrying over the sound of rain and thunder. Water streamed down his police-issue raincoat as he surveyed the scene, taking in every detail with professional precision. His eyes lingered on Mick, recognizing the dog from his regular patrols. The shepherd had always been friendly, often trotting over for a quick pat on the head when Clark made his rounds. Tonight, however, there was something almost primal in the dog's protective stance. Mrs. Martyr stepped forward, her clothes completely soaked, but her bearing dignified as ever. "He's been like this for hours, Clark," she explained, gesturing toward Mick. "Won't let anyone near the car. Something's not right. I can feel it in my bones, and you know my bones don't lie." Clark nodded, remembering how Mrs. Martyr had predicted last year's tornado 3 days before the Weather Service issued any warnings. He approached slowly, one hand resting lightly on his belt while the other remained visible at his side. "Hey there, Mick," he called softly. "Remember me, boy?" Mick's ears twitched at the sound of Clark's voice, and his tail gave the slightest wag of recognition. But his position remained unchanged. If anything, his protective stance intensified, his body shifting to place himself more firmly between the officer and the sedan's rear door. The gathering crowd had grown silent. Their collective breath held as they watched the interaction between man and dog. Even the children who had ventured out despite their parents' protests stood perfectly still, instinctively understanding the gravity of the moment. The storm continued its assault, but it had become almost background noise to the drama unfolding before them. Jacob Reynolds moved to stand beside Clark, his military bearing evident in his posture, despite his civilian clothes. "Sir," he said quietly, "I caught a glimpse of something inside the vehicle earlier. During one of the lightning flashes. Couldn't make out what it was, but—" He trailed off, letting the implication hang in the rain-heavy air. Clark's expression remained professional, but those who knew him well could see the subtle tension in his jaw. He'd learned long ago to trust the instincts of both animals and veterans. When either one acted strangely, there was usually a damn good reason for it. Sarah Martinez had joined them, her nurse's training evident in the way she analyzed the situation. "Linda Moreno hasn't been around for days," she added, voicing what many had been thinking. "That's her car, isn't it? But something feels different about it." The rain seemed to intensify as Clark processed this information, creating a curtain of water that transformed the street into a shallow river. Lightning split the sky again, and in that brief, brilliant moment, Clark saw what Jacob had noticed earlier, a shadow of movement behind the sedan's rain-streaked windows. His decision made, Clark took another step forward, moving with the careful precision that had kept him alive through countless uncertain situations. "Mick," he said firmly, "I need to check that car, boy. Whatever you're protecting, whoever you're protecting, I'm here to help." Something in his tone must have resonated with the shepherd. Mick's posture shifted slightly, his eyes meeting Clark's with an intelligence that seemed almost human. A low whine escaped his throat, not of fear or aggression, but of what sounded almost like relief. Thunder rolled overhead as Clark reached for his flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness to illuminate the interior of the sedan. The gathered neighbors unconsciously moved closer, drawn by the mounting tension and their own growing concern. Mrs. Martyr placed a steadying hand on Sarah's shoulder, while Jacob maintained his alert stance, ready to assist if needed. The beam of light revealed nothing at first, just rain-streaked windows and standard car upholstery. But as Clark moved closer, Mick's behavior changed. Instead of blocking access to the vehicle, the shepherd now moved aside slightly, though he remained vigilant. His eyes never left Clark's face, as if judging whether this human could be trusted with whatever precious cargo he had been guarding. A particularly bright flash of lightning illuminated the entire street, followed immediately by a thunderclap that seemed to shake the very ground. In that moment, Clark's flashlight beam caught something through the rear window, a small bundle wrapped in what appeared to be a blanket, moving ever so slightly in the back seat. The collective gasp from the onlookers was audible even over the storm. Clark's hand moved to the door handle, his heart pounding with a mix of professional focus and personal dread. As he prepared to open the door, Mick pressed against his leg, not to stop him, but almost as if offering support for what was to come. The door handle was slick with rain, but Clark's grip was sure as he pulled it open. The interior light flickered to life, revealing what Mick had been protecting with such fierce dedication. There, carefully wrapped in a worn blanket that had once been pink, lay a tiny infant, no more than a few days old. Time seemed to freeze for a moment, the only movement being the steady fall of rain and the rhythmic sweep of emergency lights across the gathered faces. Then everything happened at once. Sarah Martinez rushed forward with her medical training taking over. Mrs. Martyr was already pulling out her phone to call for an ambulance, and Jacob moved to help Clark secure the scene. Through it all, Mick remained steadfast, his mission changed but not abandoned. He watched intently as Sarah checked the baby's vital signs, his ears perked forward at every tiny sound the infant made. The loyal shepherd had kept his vigil through the worst of the storm, protecting this most vulnerable of lives until help could arrive. The wail of approaching sirens soon joined the symphony of the storm, but for those present, the most powerful sound was the weak but steady cry of the baby as Sarah lifted it carefully from the car. Mick's tail wagged slightly at the sound, and for the first time since the ordeal began, his posture truly relaxed. As emergency vehicles began to arrive, their lights adding to the kaleidoscope of color painting the rainy night. Clark felt a profound respect for the dog who had refused to abandon his post. Whatever circumstances had led to this moment, whatever story lay behind the baby's presence in that car, one thing was certain: Mick's unwavering loyalty had saved a life tonight. The neighborhood would never be quite the same after this stormy evening. But as the first EMTs rushed forward with their equipment, there was a sense that something extraordinary had been witnessed. In the face of uncertainty and danger, a dog's faithful heart had proven stronger than the fiercest storm, and in doing so, had brought a community together in ways they never could have imagined. The EMTs worked with practiced efficiency, their movements quick but gentle as they assessed the infant. The baby, despite hours in the cold car, showed remarkable resilience, a fighter, just like the dog who had protected it. Sarah Martinez hovered nearby, her nurse's instincts compelling her to stay close, while Mick watched every movement with intense focus, refusing to be more than a few feet from his young charge. "We need to get the baby to St. Mary's right away," the lead EMT announced, his voice carrying over the now softening rain. "Temperature, a little low, but stable. Considering the circumstances, this little one's doing remarkably well." He paused, glancing at Mick with undisguised admiration. Thanks to this fellow here, Clark Harris found himself facing an unusual dilemma. Standard procedure would have him staying at the scene, securing evidence, and beginning the preliminary investigation. But something deeper than protocol was pulling at him, a gut instinct that had served him well throughout his career. He looked at Mick, who was now dividing his attention between the baby and Clark himself, as if sensing the officer's internal struggle. "I'll handle the scene," Jacob offered, seeming to read Clark's thoughts. The former Marine's training made him an ideal choice to help secure the area until additional officers arrived. "You go with them. Something tells me you need to see this through." The decision crystallized in Clark's mind as he watched the EMTs preparing to transfer the baby to the ambulance. "Martinez," he called out to Sarah, who was already one step ahead of him, gathering her purse from her porch. "I'll follow in my car," she replied, her medical expertise making her an invaluable ally in this situation. "And before you ask, yes, I've already called the hospital to alert my colleagues in the NICU." But it was Mick who sealed the deal. As the EMTs began moving toward the ambulance, the German Shepherd's whine carried a note of distress. He took 2 steps toward the baby, then looked back at Clark with an expression that could only be described as pleading. The message was clear. He wasn't about to abandon his vigil now. "He's coming with us," Clark announced, his tone brooking no argument. The EMTs exchanged glances, but knew better than to question an officer's decision, especially given the extraordinary circumstances of the night. Besides, they'd witnessed enough to understand that separating the dog from the baby might prove impossible. The next few minutes passed in a blur of activity. The baby was secured in the ambulance, with Mick jumping in behind the stretcher before anyone could stop him. He settled himself near the infant's feet, his posture alert but calm. Clark climbed in last, nodding to Jacob, who was already coordinating with the newly arrived patrol units. As the ambulance doors closed, the last view of Cedar Street showed a community transformed. Neighbors who had been mere acquaintances hours ago now stood together, sharing umbrellas and quiet conversations. Mrs. Martyr was already organizing a phone tree to keep everyone informed, while others began collecting blankets and supplies they thought might be needed. The ambulance pulled away from the curb, its siren piercing the night as it carried its precious cargo towards St. Mary's Hospital. Inside, the EMTs worked steadily, checking vital signs and adjusting equipment. The baby, swaddled in fresh, warm blankets, made occasional soft sounds that drew Mick's immediate attention each time. Clark found himself studying the shepherd's face, noting the intelligence and dedication in those brown eyes. In his 15 years on the force, he'd seen many examples of loyalty, but something about Mick's unwavering devotion struck a deeper chord. This wasn't just about instinct or training. This was about choice, about a conscious decision to protect the vulnerable at any cost. The rain drummed steadily on the ambulance roof as they sped through the empty streets, creating a rhythm that seemed to match the baby's steady heartbeat on the monitor. Lightning still flickered occasionally in the distance, But the worst of the storm had passed, as if nature itself recognized that its role in the night's drama was complete. Sarah Martinez's car followed close behind, her headlights visible through the ambulance's rear windows. In the confined space of the emergency vehicle, time seemed to move differently. Each moment was measured not in seconds, but in breaths, the baby's soft iksha. Latians, mixed steady panting, the collective held breath of the EMTs each time they checked a vital sign. The infant stirred slightly, one tiny hand escaping the blanket's confines. Without hesitation, Mick stretched his neck forward, gently nudging the hand with his nose before looking up at Clark with what could only be described as pride. The gesture was so tender, so protective, that even the veteran EMTs paused in their work to watch. "I've been on this job for 12 years, the lead EMT said quietly, shaking his head in amazement, "and I've never seen anything quite like this." He checked another reading on his equipment, then added, "This little one's temperature is already improving. It's almost like someone knew exactly what they were doing when they left the baby in Mick's care." Clark finished, voicing the thought that had been forming in his mind since they'd first opened the car door. This hadn't been abandonment. This had been a desperate act of trust, a mother's last resort. The lights of St. Mary's Hospital began to appear ahead, a beacon of hope cutting through the remnants of the storm. As they approached the emergency entrance, Clark realized that this was just the beginning of a much larger story. Questions about the baby's identity, about Linda Moreno's whereabouts, about the circumstances that had led to this night, all would need to be answered. But for now, as the ambulance pulled up to the brightly lit emergency bay, Clark's focus was on the immediate future. The hospital staff was already waiting, alerted by Sarah's calls. They would soon enter a world of fluorescent lights and antiseptic hallways, of medical terms and procedures. Through it all, Clark knew Mick would remain steadfast, his commitment to his charge unshaken. The ambulance doors swung open to reveal a team of medical professionals ready to spring into action. As they prepared to transfer their tiny patient into the hospital's care, Clark placed a reassuring hand on Mick's head. The shepherd leaned into his touch briefly, but his eyes never left the baby, his baby, in every way that mattered. Together, they stepped out into the hospital's harsh lighting, leaving the storm behind but carrying its lessons with them. In the face of uncertainty, loyalty had proven stronger than fear. In the darkest of nights, dedication had overcome despair. And in the heart of a dog, they had discovered a truth about love that would continue to unfold in the days to come.